The sun, a pale disk in the early morning sky, began its slow ascent over the eastern horizon. Its light, still weak and diffused, cast long, indistinct shadows across the military camp. A faint chill lingered in the air, a remnant of the night, gradually yielding to the promise of a new day. Within the orderly rows of tents, the first stirrings of life could be detected. A cough here, a rustle there, the subtle creak of a bed frame as a legionary shifted in his sleep. These were the quiet beginnings of another day in the life of a Roman soldier, a day that would, in many ways, mirror the countless days that had come before it and the countless days that would undoubtedly follow. The rhythm of the camp was predictable, a steady, unchanging beat that governed every aspect of existence. There was a certain comfort in this predictability, a sense of order in a world that could often be chaotic and unpredictable. Each man knew his place, his duties, and the expectations placed upon him. There was little room for deviation, little need for improvisation. The routine was a well-worn path, a familiar journey that required little thought or effort. Simply was. And so, as the light grew stronger and the chill receded, the camp slowly, almost imperceptibly, began to awaken. The sounds became a little louder, the movements a little more deliberate. The day, like all days, had begun. The first sounds to truly break the silence were the distant calls of birds, a chirping that seemed to grow in intensity as the sky lightened. Soon after, the more familiar sounds of the camp began to emerge. The clatter of metal, the low murmur of voices, the rhythmic thud of feet on packed earth. These were the sounds of men preparing for another day of duty, a symphony of mundane activities that marked the transition from sleep to wakefulness. Legionaries, one by one, began to emerge from their tents, their faces still creased with sleep, their movements slow and deliberate. There was no rush, no urgency. The morning routine was a ritual, a series of prescribed actions that had been performed countless times before. Each man knew what was expected of him, and he performed his tasks with a quiet efficiency born of long practice. They would stretch, perhaps yawn, and then begin the simple process of preparing themselves for the day ahead. This involved adjusting their tunics, ensuring their sandals were properly secured, and generally making themselves presentable for the rigors of military life. The air, once still, now carried the faint scent of wood smoke, as small fires were kindled for the morning meal. The smoke rose in thin, lazy columns, dissipating quickly into the brightening sky. It was a smell that was intimately associated with camp life, a constant reminder of the communal existence shared by all legionaries. The fires, small and controlled, provided a modest warmth, a welcome comfort in the lingering morning chill. Around these fires, small groups of men would gather, their conversations hushed and understated. There was little need for animated discussion. The topics of conversation were as predictable as the routine itself. The weather, the quality of the rations, the upcoming duties, these were the simple subjects that occupied their minds. There was a quiet camaraderie among them, a shared understanding that transcended the need for elaborate words. They were bound by their common purpose, their shared experiences, and the unspoken knowledge that they were all part of something larger than themselves. The morning meal itself was a simple affair. Hardtack, perhaps some dried fruit, and a measure of pasca, a sour wine mixed with water. It was sustenance, nothing more, designed to provide the necessary energy for the day's tasks without offering any undue pleasure. The act of eating was quick and efficient, a necessary interlude before the serious business of the day began. There was no lingering over the meal, no savoring of flavors. It was a functional activity, performed with a quiet resignation. The silence that often accompanied these meals was not one of discomfort, but rather one of quiet contemplation. Each man was lost in his own thoughts, preparing himself mentally for the hours that lay ahead. The sun continued its ascent, its rays now beginning to penetrate the camp with greater intensity. The shadows shortened, and the air grew warmer. The sounds of the camp became more pronounced, a steady hum of activity that indicated the full awakening of the legion. The time for quiet reflection was drawing to a close. The time for duty was at hand. The morning, in its slow and deliberate unfolding, had reached its inevitable conclusion. The day, in all its monotonous glory, was ready to begin. As the last crumbs of the morning meal were brushed away, the legionaries began to prepare for the day's first official duties. This often involved a general assembly, a gathering of the men in a designated area of the camp. The purpose of this assembly was not always dramatic. More often than not, it was simply to receive the day's orders, to be reminded of the schedule, and to ensure that all men were present and accounted for. The process of forming up was itself a testament to the legion's discipline. Rows would form with precision, each man taking his accustomed place, his eyes fixed forward, his posture rigid. There was no chatter, no fidgeting. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional command from a centurion, delivered in a clear, measured tone. These commands were not shouted, but rather spoken with an authority that left no room for misinterpretation. The men understood and they obeyed. The sun, now higher in the sky, cast a brighter, more direct light upon the assembled ranks. The dust, disturbed by the movement of so many feet, began to rise in a fine haze, catching the sunlight and creating a shimmering, almost ethereal effect. It was a common sight, one that was repeated day after day, week after week, year after year. The faces of the legionaries, though varied in their individual features, shared a common expression of quiet endurance. There was no excitement, no anticipation. There was only the steady, unwavering commitment to the task at hand. The orders, when they came, were typically brief and to the point. They might concern the day's training exercises, the allocation of duties, or perhaps a general reminder of camp regulations. There was little room for discussion or debate. The orders were given, and they were to be carried out. The simplicity of these directives was a reflection of the Legion's operational philosophy: efficiency, order, and unwavering obedience. After the assembly, the men would disperse, each heading to his assigned task. For some, it would be a day of drills on the training ground, practicing formations, weapon handling, and marching. For others, it might involve maintenance duties within the camp, repairing equipment, cleaning latrines, or tending to the camp's infrastructure. Still others might be assigned to guard duty, manning the watchtowers or patrolling the perimeter. Each task, no matter how seemingly insignificant, contributed to the overall functioning of the Legion. There was a sense of interconnectedness, a recognition that every man's effort, however small, played a vital role in the larger machine. The day unfolded with a predictable rhythm, a series of tasks performed with methodical precision. The sun continued its journey across the sky, marking the passage of time with its steady, unwavering progress. The sounds of the camp, once a gentle hum, now became a more pronounced symphony of activity. The clang of hammers, the shouts of instructors, the rhythmic pounding of feet. These were the sounds of a legion at work, a testament to its unwavering dedication to duty. The hours passed, each one blending seamlessly into the next, a continuous flow of routine and repetition. There was little to distinguish one moment from another, save for the subtle shifts in light and shadow as the sun moved overhead. The legionaries, immersed in their tasks, moved with a quiet efficiency, their movements honed by countless hours of practice. Their minds, perhaps, drifted to other things, to distant homes or forgotten dreams, but their bodies remained firmly rooted in the present, performing the duties that defined their existence. The day, in its steady, unhurried progression, continued its march towards evening, another chapter in the endless saga of the Roman legionary's life. The morning sun, now fully risen, cast its golden light across the training grounds. The air, still cool from the night, was beginning to warm, promising a day of exertion. Legionaries, having completed their morning meal and assembly, began to gather in the designated areas, their movements precise and practiced. This was the time for training, a fundamental aspect of their daily lives, as ingrained as eating or sleeping. The drills were not new. They were repetitions of movements and formations learned countless times before. Yet, each repetition was treated with the same seriousness, the same unwavering focus. There was no room for complacency, no allowance for error. Discipline was paramount, a constant, unyielding force that shaped every action, every thought. The centurions, their voices clear and resonant, issued commands that echoed across the field. These commands were simple, direct, and unambiguous. They spoke of forward movements, of turning, of raising shields, of thrusting spears. Each command was followed by a synchronized response, a collective movement of bodies and equipment that spoke of hours, days, weeks, and years of relentless practice. The rhythmic thud of feet on the packed earth, the clang of wooden swords against shields, the grunts of effort, these were the sounds of the training ground, a monotonous symphony of physical exertion. The dust, disturbed by the constant movement, rose in a fine cloud, coating everything in a thin, gritty layer. It settled on tunics, on skin, on equipment, a constant reminder of the physical demands of their profession. Sweat beaded on foreheads, trickled down temples, and stained the fabric of their clothing. It was a natural consequence of their efforts, a visible manifestation of their dedication. There was no complaint, no murmur of discontent. The work was hard, but it was necessary. It was the foundation upon which their lives and the lives of the empire were built. The sun climbed higher, its warmth intensifying, but the pace of the training did not slacken. The legionaries moved with a steady, unhurried rhythm, their movements efficient and economical. There was no wasted energy, no superfluous motion. Every action served a purpose, every movement contributed to the overall effectiveness of the unit. The training was not about individual prowess, but about collective strength, about the seamless integration of each man into the larger whole. The individual was subsumed by the legion, his identity merged with that of his comrades. This was the essence of Roman military might, a force forged not just from steel and strategy, but from an unyielding commitment to discipline and unity. The hours passed, marked only by the changing position of the sun and the increasing weariness in their limbs. Yet, they continued, driven by an internal fortitude that transcended mere physical discomfort. The training was a test, a constant reaffirmation of their readiness, their resilience, and their unwavering loyalty. It was a silent promise made to themselves and to the empire that they would always be prepared, always be ready, always be capable. And so, the day continued, a relentless cycle of effort and repetition, a testament to the enduring spirit of the Roman legionary. The drills continued, each one flowing seamlessly into the next, a continuous tapestry of movement and command. The legionaries practiced their shield wall, a formidable defensive formation that had proven its worth on countless battlefields. They moved as one, shields interlocking, creating an impenetrable barrier against any foe. The weight of the shield, the constant pressure against their arm, the heat radiating from their bodies, these were the sensations that accompanied the drill. There was no thought of discomfort, only the unwavering focus on maintaining the integrity of the line. The centurions walked among them, their eyes sharp, their presence a constant reminder of the standards that were expected. A slight misalignment, a momentary lapse in concentration, and a sharp word would cut through the air, correcting the error with swift precision. There was no anger in their voices, only a calm, unwavering authority. They were sculptors of men, shaping raw recruits into hardened warriors, honing their skills to a razor-backslash edge. The sun beat down, its rays growing more intense with each passing hour. The dust, churned by hundreds of feet, hung in the air, a hazy veil that softened the edges of the camp. The rhythmic sounds of training continued, a hypnotic beat that filled the air. The clatter of pila, the short throwing spears, as they were hurled at imaginary enemies, the dull thud of gladii, the short swords, as they struck practiced dummies. Each sound was a testament to the dedication of the men, to their tireless pursuit of perfection. The training was not just about physical prowess. It was about mental fortitude, about the ability to endure, to persevere, to push past the limits of what seemed possible. It was about building a collective will, a shared determination that would hold firm in the face of adversity. The legionaries understood this. They embraced the hardship, knowing that it was through such trials that they became stronger, more resilient, more capable. The midday sun reached its zenith, casting short, sharp shadows. A brief respite was granted, a moment to catch their breath, to wipe the sweat from their brows, to take a quick drink of water. There was little conversation during these breaks. The men were too focused on their recovery, on preparing themselves for the next phase of training. The silence was a welcome relief, a brief interlude in the relentless rhythm of the day. Then, with a sharp command, the drills would resume, the familiar sounds and movements beginning anew. The afternoon brought more of the same, a continuation of the morning/s efforts. The focus shifted to marching, to covering long distances with heavy packs, to maintaining formation over uneven terrain. This was the essence of legionary movement, the ability to transport a large, disciplined force across vast distances, arriving at their destination ready for battle. The rhythmic crunch of their sandals on the ground, the steady swing of their arms, the collective breathing of hundreds of men, these were the sounds of a legion on the move. The landscape blurred, a monotonous procession of fields, hills, and occasional streams. There was little to see, little to distract from the task at hand. Their gaze was fixed forward, their minds focused on the next step, the next mile. The discipline was absolute, a silent agreement among them to endure, to push forward, no matter the fatigue, no matter the discomfort. The sun began its slow descent, casting long shadows once more. The air began to cool, a welcome change after the heat of the day. The training, though still rigorous, began to wind down. The final drills were performed with the same precision as the first, a testament to their unwavering commitment. As the light faded, the legionaries returned to camp, their bodies weary, their minds calm. Another day of training was complete, another step taken on the long, familiar path of a Roman legionary. The sun had begun its slow descent, casting long, distorted shadows across the camp. The air, once filled with the sounds of training, was now quieter, a low hum of activity replacing the earlier clamor. For some legionaries, the day's exertions were far from over. The duty of standing guard, a constant and unwavering responsibility, now fell upon them. This was a task that demanded vigilance, a quiet endurance that often went unnoticed, yet was crucial to the safety and security of the entire legion. The watchtower, a simple wooden structure, stood tall against the fading light. From its elevated position, the legionary on duty had a panoramic view of the surrounding landscape. Fields stretched out in every direction, their colors muted by the approaching twilight. The distant tree-line, a dark, indistinct mass, offered little in the way of visual interest. The sky, a vast expanse of deepening blue, slowly began to reveal the first faint stars. The silence was profound, broken only by the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze, the distant chirping of crickets, and the occasional hoot of an owl. There was little to see, little to hear, little to do but watch. The hours passed with a slow, deliberate rhythm. Each minute seemed to stretch into an eternity, each hour a small lifetime. The legionary shifted his weight, adjusted his grip on his spear, and scanned the horizon once more. His eyes, though weary, remained sharp, constantly searching for any sign of movement, any hint of an anomaly. The mind, left to its own devices, could wander, drifting to distant memories, to loved ones far away, to dreams of a life beyond the confines of the camp. But always the discipline would pull it back, reminding him of his duty, of the unwavering vigilance that was required. The night deepened, and the stars, once faint, now blazed with a cold, distant brilliance. The moon, a pale crescent, cast a soft, ethereal glow upon the landscape. The camp below, once a hive of activity, was now a collection of dark, silent shapes, its inhabitants lost in the depths of sleep. Only the flickering light of the watch fires and the occasional movement of a patrolling sentry offered any indication of life. The air grew colder, and a thin mist began to rise from the low-lying areas, clinging to the ground like a ghostly shroud. The legionary pulled his cloak tighter, seeking what little warmth it could offer. The cold was a constant companion, a subtle discomfort that permeated every aspect of his being. Yet he endured, his resolve unwavering. The duty was paramount, a sacred trust that could not be broken. The world outside the camp was a place of uncertainty, of potential danger. It was his responsibility to stand between that world and the sleeping legion, to be the eyes and ears that protected them from harm. And so he watched and waited and endured, a silent sentinel against the encroaching darkness. The hours of the night passed with a deliberate slowness, each one marked by the changing position of the stars and the deepening chill in the air. The legionary on watch maintained his silent vigil, his senses heightened, his attention unwavering. The sounds of the camp were minimal now, a symphony of soft snores, the occasional rustle of straw, and the gentle creak of tent poles in the breeze. These were the sounds of a sleeping army, a testament to the peace and security that his watch, and the watches of countless others, provided. His gaze swept across the perimeter, noting the faint outlines of the palisade, the subtle undulations of the ditch beyond. Every shadow held the potential for movement, every whisper of wind a possible harbinger of danger. Yet, for the most part, the night remained uneventful, a long stretch of quiet observation. The monotony was a test in itself, a challenge to his focus and endurance. It was easy for the mind to drift, to succumb to the lure of sleep, but the consequences of such a lapse were too dire to contemplate. He would shift his weight, stamp his feet to ward off the cold, and occasionally hum a low, tuneless melody to himself, just enough to keep his thoughts from wandering too far. The moon, now higher in the sky, cast a brighter, more defined light, illuminating the camp in shades of silver and gray. The outlines of the tents, once indistinct, now stood out with a stark clarity. The ground, still damp from the evening mist, shimmered faintly under the lunar glow. It was a beautiful yet desolate scene, a stark reminder of the isolation that often accompanied the duty of a sentry. He was alone, yet he was part of something vast and powerful, a small cog in a massive machine designed for order and defense. The thought brought a strange sense of comfort, a quiet reassurance in the face of the overwhelming stillness. The occasional sound of a fellow sentry, a cough or a soft movement from a distant watchtower, served as a subtle reminder that he was not entirely alone. They were all connected, bound by the shared responsibility of their watch, a silent network of vigilance that encompassed the entire camp. The concept of time in this quiet solitude became fluid, almost meaningless. It was not measured by the ticking of a clock, but by the slow progression of the stars, by the gradual shift in the quality of the light, by the subtle changes in the temperature of the air. He was simply existing in the moment, a living embodiment of watchfulness. The cold continued to seep into his bones, a persistent ache that he had long since learned to ignore. His thoughts were simple, focused on the immediate present. The feel of the spear in his hand, the texture of the ground beneath his feet, the vast, silent expanse of the night sky above him. There was a certain peace in this simplicity, a freedom from the complexities of the day. The night was a time for quiet reflection, for a deeper connection with the fundamental realities of his existence. He was a soldier, and this was his duty. And so he stood, a silent guardian against the encroaching darkness, waiting for the first faint blush of dawn to appear on the eastern horizon, signaling the end of his watch and the beginning of another day for the Legion. The sun, now high in the sky, cast a harsh, unwavering light upon the camp. The morning's training drills had concluded, and for many legionaries, the next phase of their day involved a different kind of exertion: construction and maintenance. The Roman legion was not merely a fighting force. It was also a formidable engineering corps, capable of building roads, bridges, and fortifications with remarkable speed and efficiency. This was a constant, ongoing process, a relentless battle against the elements and the wear and tear of daily life. The air was filled with the sounds of hammers striking wood, the rhythmic scrape of shovels against earth, and the occasional grunt of effort as heavy stones were moved into place. Dust, a perpetual companion in the camp, rose in clouds, coating everything in a fine, gritty layer. It settled on their hair, their faces, their clothing, a constant reminder of the physical nature of their work. The tasks were varied, but all shared a common thread. They were repetitive, demanding, and essential. Some legionaries were engaged in the construction of new defensive structures, perhaps extending the palisade or deepening the ditch that surrounded the camp. Others were repairing existing buildings, patching roofs, mending fences, or shoring up walls that had been weakened by time or weather. Still others were involved in the maintenance of the camp's infrastructure, clearing drainage ditches, repairing pathways, or ensuring the proper functioning of the water supply. There was no room for idleness, no opportunity for a moment's rest. Every man had a role to play, every hand was needed. The centurions, ever vigilant, moved among them, their eyes scanning for any sign of inefficiency or slackness. Their presence was a constant spur, a silent reminder of the standards that were expected. A misplaced timber, a poorly dug trench, a loose nail, these were not minor errors, but potential weaknesses that could compromise the safety and effectiveness of the entire camp. The work was not glamorous, nor was it exciting. It was a monotonous grind, a continuous cycle of physical labor that stretched from dawn until dusk. Yet, there was a certain satisfaction in it, a quiet pride in the knowledge that they were contributing to the strength and security of the legion. Each nail hammered, each stone laid, each shovelful of earth moved, these were small acts, but together, they built something enduring, something that would protect them and their comrades. The sun beat down, its heat relentless, but the work continued, unceasing. Sweat streamed down their faces, stinging their eyes, but they did not falter. Their muscles ached, their backs protested, but they pushed through the discomfort, driven by a sense of duty and a shared commitment to the legion. The Roman legionary was not just a warrior. He was also a builder, a craftsman, a tireless worker who understood that the strength of the empire rested not just on its military might, but also on its ability to construct and maintain the infrastructure that supported its vast reach. And so, the day unfolded, a relentless cycle of labor and construction, a testament to the enduring spirit of the Roman legionary. The construction work continued with a steady, unhurried pace. The legionaries moved with a practiced efficiency, each man knowing his role, each movement contributing to the overall progress. There was little conversation, only the sounds of their labor. The rhythmic thud of mallets on wooden stakes, the scrape of trowels against mortar, the creak of ropes as heavy loads were hoisted. The air was thick with the scent of freshly cut timber and damp earth, a familiar aroma that permeated every corner of the camp. The tasks were often repetitive, requiring little thought beyond the immediate action. A legionary might spend hours digging a trench, his shovel rising and falling with monotonous regularity. Another might be tasked with carrying stones, his shoulders aching under the weight, his steps heavy and deliberate. Yet another might be shaping timbers, his axe biting into the wood with a dull, satisfying thud. The work was physically demanding, a constant test of endurance and strength. Muscles burned, sweat stung their eyes, and their hands grew calloused and rough. But there was no complaint, no murmur of discontent. This was their duty, a fundamental aspect of their lives as soldiers. They understood that the strength of the camp, its ability to withstand attack, depended on the quality of their work. Every joint, every beam, every stone was a testament to their dedication. The sun continued its relentless journey across the sky, its heat intensifying with each passing hour. The dust, disturbed by their constant movement, rose in a fine, powdery cloud, settling on their skin and clothing. It was a constant companion, a gritty reminder of the physical nature of their existence. The water carriers moved among them, offering dippers of cool water, a brief respite from the heat and the dust. The water, though simple, was a welcome relief, a momentary quenching of the thirst that seemed to be a permanent state. The afternoon brought no change in the pace of work. The construction continued, unceasing, a testament to the legionaries' unwavering commitment. The walls of the new barracks slowly rose, brick by brick, stone by stone. The palisade grew taller, its sharpened stakes pointing defiantly towards the sky. The ditches deepened, their sides steep and unforgiving. Each completed section was a small victory, a tangible sign of their progress. The work was not about speed, but about precision and durability. They built to last, to withstand the ravages of time and the assaults of any enemy. The tools they used were simple, yet effective. Shovels, picks, axes, hammers, and saws. These were the extensions of their hands, the instruments through which they shaped the world around them. The skills they possessed were not learned overnight. They were the culmination of years of practice, passed down from one generation of legionaries to the next. The sun began its slow descent, casting long shadows across the camp once more. The air began to cool, offering a slight reprieve from the day's heat. Yet, the work continued, driven by the knowledge that there was still much to be done before nightfall. The sounds of construction would gradually fade as the light diminished, replaced by the softer sounds of the evening routine. But for now, the rhythmic sounds of building continued, a steady, unyielding testament to the tireless efforts of the Roman legionary. As the day drew to a close, the legionaries, though tired, felt a quiet sense of accomplishment. The new structures stood firm, the repairs were complete, and the camp was a little more secure than it had been that morning. This was the essence of their daily lives, a continuous cycle of labor, discipline, and contribution to the greater good of the legion. The setting sun cast long, golden shadows across the newly built walls, a silent testament to their unwavering dedication. The air, now cooler, carried the scent of wood smoke and damp earth, a comforting aroma that signaled the end of another long day. The sounds of the camp began to change, the clamor of construction replaced by the softer murmurs of evening routines. Soon, they would gather for their evening meal, a simple but well-earned reward for their tireless efforts. The day had been long, filled with monotonous tasks and physical exertion, but it had also been productive. Each legionary, in his own way, had contributed to the strength and resilience of the Roman military machine. And as darkness finally enveloped the camp, a quiet peace settled over the weary soldiers, a peace earned through hard work and unwavering commitment. The midday sun hung high above the Roman camp, casting short, sharp shadows. The intense heat of the afternoon had settled over everything, making even the simplest movements feel like a burden. For the legionaries, this was a time for a brief, much-needed respite from the relentless demands of their daily duties. It was the time for the midday meal, a moment of quiet consumption and temporary relief. The air, thick with the scent of wood smoke and cooking food, carried the low murmur of voices from various parts of the camp. There was no boisterous laughter or loud conversation, just a subdued hum of activity as men gathered their rations and found a spot to sit. The meal itself was simple as always, a portion of hardtack, perhaps some dried meat or cheese, and a measure of diluted wine or water. It was sustenance, not a feast, designed to provide the necessary energy for the remainder of the day's tasks without offering any unnecessary indulgence. Each legionary ate in a methodical, unhurried manner. There was no rush, no competition for food. Every bite was chewed thoroughly, every sip savored, not for its taste, but for the nourishment it provided. The act of eating was a routine, a necessary function, performed with a quiet efficiency that reflected the overall discipline of their lives. Some men sat alone, their gaze fixed on some distant, unseen point, their thoughts perhaps wandering to places far from the dusty confines of the camp. Others sat in small groups, their conversations low and infrequent, punctuated by long silences. There was a shared understanding among them, a silent camaraderie born of shared hardship and common purpose. They did not need many words to communicate. A glance, a nod, a shared sigh was often enough. The sounds of eating were subtle. The gentle crunch of hard bread, the soft slurping of water, the occasional clink of a metal cup against a wooden surface. These were the sounds of men replenishing their bodies, preparing for the next phase of their day. The sun continued its slow, deliberate arc across the sky, its heat unwavering. The shadows, which had been short at midday, began to lengthen imperceptibly, a subtle indication of the passage of time. The dust, disturbed by their movements, rose in faint wisps, settling back down with a quiet sigh. The flies, ever present, buzzed lazily in the heat, a constant, low drone that blended into the background noise of the camp. The meal was not a time for recreation, but for necessary refueling. There were no games, no elaborate entertainments. The brief period of rest was dedicated solely to the consumption of food and the conservation of energy. It was a practical interlude, a functional pause in the relentless rhythm of their lives. As the last morsels were consumed and the last drops of liquid swallowed, a quiet sense of readiness began to settle over the camp. The brief respite was drawing to a close. The time for rest was over, and the time for duty was about to begin once more. The legionaries would slowly rise, gather their meager belongings, and prepare themselves for the afternoon's tasks. The cycle continued, an endless repetition of work, rest, and preparation, each segment flowing seamlessly into the next. The midday meal, though brief and unremarkable, was a vital component of this cycle, a small but essential pause that allowed the Roman legionary to endure the monotonous demands of his daily existence. And so, the quiet hum of the camp would gradually give way to the more purposeful sounds of renewed activity, as the legionaries returned to their duties, their bodies nourished, their minds refreshed, ready to face the unchanging rhythm of their lives. After the meal, the brief period of rest continued, though it was not a time for idleness. For some, it was an opportunity to attend to small personal tasks. A legionary might carefully inspect his armor, checking for any signs of wear or damage, polishing a dull spot on his breastplate, or tightening a loose strap on his greaves. Another might sharpen his sword, the rhythmic rasp of stone against metal a familiar and comforting sound. These were not duties assigned by a centurion, but rather personal responsibilities, a quiet dedication to maintaining the tools of their trade. The condition of their equipment was a matter of pride, a reflection of their discipline and readiness. A well-maintained sword was a reliable companion in battle, a polished shield a testament to their vigilance. The air, though still warm, seemed to carry a different quality now, a subtle shift from the intensity of midday. The shadows continued to lengthen, stretching across the dusty ground, offering small patches of shade that were eagerly sought out. The sounds of the camp remained subdued, a gentle murmur of activity that never quite ceased. The distant clatter of a blacksmith at his forge, the faint shouts of men engaged in some minor task, the soft rustle of straw as a legionary shifted his position. These were the background noises of their existence, a constant reminder of the collective life they shared. Some legionaries chose to spend their brief respite in quiet contemplation. They might sit with their backs against a tent pole, their eyes closed, their minds drifting. Perhaps they revisited memories of home, of family, of a life that seemed distant and almost unreal in the harsh reality of the camp. Or perhaps they simply rested, allowing their bodies to recover from the morning's exertions and prepare for the afternoon's demands. There was no pressure to engage in conversation, no expectation of entertainment. The silence was a welcome companion, a rare luxury in a life filled with constant noise and activity. The sun, though still powerful, had begun its slow descent towards the western horizon. Its light, once harsh and direct, softened, casting a warmer, more golden hue over the camp. The dust, which had been so prominent earlier, seemed to settle, creating a hazy, almost dreamlike atmosphere. The flies, though still present, seemed less insistent, their buzzing a less intrusive sound. The brief period of rest was drawing to a close. The subtle signals were everywhere. The increasing movement of men, the gathering of tools, the quiet preparations for the next phase of their duties. The rhythm of the camp was about to shift once more, from the quiet contemplation of rest to the purposeful activity of work. The legionaries, their bodies somewhat refreshed, their minds somewhat cleared, would soon rise and return to their assigned tasks. The afternoon would bring more of the same, more labor, more discipline, more of the monotonous routine that defined their lives. But for now, in these fleeting moments of quiet respite, they found a brief escape, a temporary reprieve from the relentless demands of their existence. It was a small comfort, but a vital one, allowing them to endure the unchanging rhythm of their days. And as the sun continued its slow journey towards the horizon, the camp would gradually awaken once more, its inhabitants ready to resume their duties, their lives a continuous cycle of effort and endurance. As the sun began its final descent, casting long, fading shadows across the Roman camp, a subtle shift in the atmosphere became apparent. The clamor of the day's activities gradually subsided, replaced by a more subdued hum as legionaries began to prepare for the evening rituals. This was a time for winding down, for attending to personal needs, and for the collective transition from the demands of labor to the quiet anticipation of rest. The air, once thick with dust and the scent of exertion, now carried the faint aroma of cooking fires and damp earth. The sounds of the camp softened, the distant clatter of mess kits, the low murmur of voices, the occasional whinny of a horse from the stables. These were the familiar sounds of an army settling down for the night, a comforting symphony of domesticity that offered a brief respite from the rigors of military life. Legionaries moved with a practiced efficiency, their movements unhurried but purposeful. Some gathered their meager belongings, carefully folding their cloaks or arranging their personal effects within their tents. Others attended to their weapons and armor, giving them a final wipe down or checking for any damage incurred during the day. This meticulous attention to detail was not merely a matter of discipline. It was a fundamental aspect of their survival. A well-maintained sword was a reliable companion, a clean shield a testament to their readiness. The water buckets, which had been constantly refilled throughout the day, were now used for personal ablutions. A quick splash of cool water on the face and hands, a brief rinse of the mouth. These were simple acts, yet they offered a sense of cleanliness and refreshment after a long day of toil. The dust and grime of the camp were temporarily washed away, leaving a fleeting sensation of renewal. The evening meal, though simple, was a focal point of this transition. Legionaries gathered in their contubernia, sharing their rations in a quiet camaraderie. The conversation was minimal, often limited to practical matters or brief observations about the day. There was no need for elaborate discussions. Their shared experiences spoke volumes. The act of eating together, even in silence, reinforced the bonds of brotherhood that were essential to their cohesion as a fighting force. As darkness deepened, the flickering light of the oil lamps and campfires cast dancing shadows on the tent walls. The sounds of activity gradually diminished, replaced by the quiet stillness of a sleeping army. Only the occasional call of a sentry or the distant hoot of an owl would break the silence. The day, filled with monotonous labor and unwavering discipline, had come to an end. The Roman legionary, a master of both warfare and construction, would now rest, his body weary but his mind at peace, knowing that he had contributed to the enduring strength and security of the empire. And with the rising sun, the cycle would begin anew, a relentless rhythm of duty, labor, and quiet endurance. The preparation for sleep was a ritual in itself, a series of deliberate actions designed to ensure maximum rest and readiness for the following day. Each legionary would find his designated spot within the tent, often a small, cramped space shared with several comrades. The straw mattress, though rough, offered a familiar comfort, a temporary haven from the hard ground. The wool blanket, though thin, provided a measure of warmth against the encroaching night chill. There was a quiet order to their movements, a silent understanding of personal space within the communal living arrangements. The sounds of breathing, soft and rhythmic, filled the tent, a testament to the exhaustion of bodies pushed to their limits. The occasional cough or sigh would punctuate the stillness, but for the most part, the night was a time for deep, restorative sleep. The legionary would lie on his back, his hands clasped over his chest, his eyes closed. His thoughts, which had been so active during the day, would gradually slow, drifting into a state of quiet contemplation. He might reflect on the day's events, the tasks accomplished, the challenges overcome. Or perhaps his mind would wander to more personal matters, to memories of home, of family, of a life far removed from the constant demands of military service. These were fleeting thoughts, however, quickly replaced by the growing weight of sleep. The body, weary from physical exertion, craved rest, and the mind, though disciplined, readily surrendered to its demands. The darkness outside the tent was absolute, broken only by the faint glow of distant watch fires. The sounds of the camp were muted, a low hum that blended into the background noise of the night. The air grew colder, and a thin mist began to rise from the low-lying areas, clinging to the ground like a ghostly shroud. But within the tent, there was a sense of warmth and security, a shared sanctuary from the elements and the potential dangers of the outside world. The legionary would drift into a deep, dreamless sleep, his body recovering, his mind at peace. The hours of the night would pass quickly, marked only by the changing of the guard and the subtle shift in the quality of the air. And as the first faint blush of dawn began to appear on the eastern horizon, he would awaken, refreshed and ready to face another day of duty, another cycle of labor and discipline. The evening rituals, though simple, were essential to the well-being of the Roman legionary, providing a necessary transition from the demands of the day to the restorative power of sleep, ensuring that he was always prepared for the relentless rhythm of his life in the service of the empire. The quiet of the night was a profound thing, a blanket that settled over the camp, muffling the sounds of the world beyond. Only the most essential noises remained: the soft rustle of leaves in the distant trees, the gentle sigh of the wind, the occasional hoot of an owl. These were the sounds of nature, indifferent to the human presence, yet they provided a soothing backdrop to the legionary's slumber. Each man, in his own way, sought to find comfort in the familiar routines, in the knowledge that his comrades were close by, sharing the same quiet space. The shared vulnerability of sleep created a silent bond, a collective trust that transcended the hierarchies of rank and duty. For a few precious hours, they were simply men, resting, recovering, preparing for the demands of another day. The darkness was a welcome embrace, a temporary escape from the harsh realities of their existence. It was a time for the body to heal, for the mind to clear, for the spirit to find a brief moment of peace. And as the night deepened, the camp became a single, breathing entity, a vast collection of sleeping bodies, each one a testament to the enduring strength and resilience of the Roman legion. The life of a Roman legionary was not confined to the static boundaries of a fortified camp. Often, their duties called them to move, to march across vast distances, to establish temporary encampments in unfamiliar territories. This was the life on the march, a continuous cycle of movement, adaptation, and the relentless pursuit of order in a constantly changing landscape. The morning began early, long before the first hint of dawn. The camp, which had been a silent collection of tents just hours before, now buzzed with a low, purposeful energy. Legionaries, roused from their sleep, quickly dismantled their tents, rolled their blankets, and prepared their meager belongings for the day's journey. There was a quiet efficiency to their movements, a practiced rhythm born of countless repetitions. Each man knew his role, each task was performed with a minimum of fuss. The air was cool and damp, carrying the scent of damp earth and wood smoke from the last embers of the campfires. The sounds were muted, the soft clatter of equipment, the low murmur of voices, the rhythmic crunch of boots on the gravelly ground. As the first faint light appeared on the eastern horizon, the legionaries formed up, their ranks precise and orderly. The centurions, their voices low but firm, gave the commands, and the vast column began to move. The initial pace was slow, a deliberate rhythm designed to conserve energy for the long hours ahead. Each step was measured, each stride consistent. The ground beneath their feet varied. Sometimes it was a well-worn road, smooth and easy to traverse. At other times, it was rough, uneven terrain, demanding constant attention and careful footing. The landscape changed with each passing mile. Sometimes they marched through dense forests, the trees towering above them, their branches forming a canopy that filtered the sunlight into dappled patterns on the ground. At other times, they crossed open plains, the vast expanse stretching out before them, seemingly endless. Rivers were forded, hills were climbed, and valleys were descended, each geographical feature presenting its own unique challenges. The sounds of the march were monotonous. The rhythmic tramp of thousands of boots, the creak of leather, the occasional jingle of armor. Conversation was minimal, limited to brief exchanges or necessary commands. Each legionary was lost in his own thoughts, his mind focused on the immediate task of putting one foot in front of the other. The sun, as it rose higher in the sky, brought with it a relentless heat. Sweat streamed down their faces, stinging their eyes, but they did not falter. Their bodies ached, their muscles protested, but they pushed through the discomfort, driven by a sense of duty and the unwavering discipline that was ingrained in every Roman soldier. The dust, stirred up by their passage, rose in clouds, coating everything in a fine, gritty layer. It settled on their hair, their faces, their clothing, a constant reminder of the physical nature of their journey. Brief halts were taken, usually at midday, to allow for a quick meal and a moment of rest. These were not long pauses, just enough time to replenish their energy before resuming the march. The water, though often warm and dusty, was a welcome relief, a momentary quenching of the thirst that seemed to be a permanent state. As the afternoon wore on, the pace remained consistent. The destination, though often distant, was always in their minds. They were a moving force, a disciplined machine, advancing steadily towards their objective. The landscape continued to unfold before them, a continuous panorama of changing scenery, yet the rhythm of their march remained constant, an unchanging beat in a world of flux. The day ended as it began, with the establishment of a temporary camp. The process was familiar, a well-rehearsed ritual. Tents were erected, a palisade was constructed, and a ditch was dug, all with remarkable speed and efficiency. Within hours, a new, temporary home had been created, a safe haven for the weary legionaries. The evening meal was simple, consumed in quiet exhaustion. The sounds of the camp were subdued, a low hum of activity as men prepared for sleep. The day had been long, filled with monotonous movement and unwavering discipline, but it had also been productive. Each legionary, in his own way, had contributed to the strength and resilience of the Roman military machine. And as darkness finally enveloped the camp, a quiet peace settled over the weary soldiers, a peace earned through hard work and unwavering commitment. The life on the march was a continuous cycle of movement and temporary settlement, a relentless rhythm that ensured the smooth functioning of the vast Roman military machine. And in that rhythm, there was a strange, quiet beauty, a profound sense of purpose that transcended the mundane details of daily existence. As the last embers of the campfires faded into the deepening night, a profound stillness settled over the Roman encampment. The sounds of the day, the clatter of tools, the murmur of voices, the rhythmic tramp of marching feet, had all receded, replaced by a quiet that was almost absolute. This was the domain of the night, a time for rest, for reflection, and for the silent vigil of the centuries. The air grew cooler, carrying with it the crisp scent of damp earth and distant pine. The stars, countless and indifferent, began to emerge in the inky blackness above, their faint light offering a subtle illumination to the sleeping camp. It was a vast, silent tableau, a testament to the enduring power of the night. The legionaries, nestled within their tents, were deep in slumber, their bodies recovering from the day's exertions. Their breathing was soft and rhythmic, a collective sigh that filled the canvas shelters. The occasional cough or restless shift was quickly absorbed by the pervasive quiet, leaving only the steady hum of an army at rest. For those on guard duty, however, the night was a time of heightened awareness. They stood at their posts, their eyes scanning the darkness, their ears attuned to the slightest sound. The changing of the guard was a silent ritual, a passing of the torch from one vigilant pair of eyes to the next. No words were exchanged, only a subtle nod, a shared understanding of the responsibility that rested upon their shoulders. The hours of the night passed slowly, marked only by the imperceptible shift of the stars across the sky. The moon, if present, cast long, ghostly shadows across the camp, transforming familiar shapes into distorted figures. The wind, a gentle whisper, rustled through the leaves of the nearby trees, creating a soft, almost hypnotic sound. These were the sounds of the night, a subtle symphony that accompanied the silent vigil of the centuries. Their thoughts, though disciplined, often drifted. They might recall memories of home, of family, of a life far removed from the constant demands of military service. Or perhaps they simply contemplated the vastness of the night, the endless expanse of the sky, the quiet solitude of their post. These were fleeting thoughts, however, quickly replaced by the immediate demands of their duty. Every shadow was a potential threat, every rustle a possible intrusion. Their senses were heightened, their minds alert, ready to respond to any sign of danger. The cold seeped into their bones, a constant reminder of the passage of time. They shifted their weight, stamped their feet, and rubbed their hands together, small movements designed to ward off the chill. But their gaze remained fixed on the darkness, their vigilance unwavering. The camp, though silent, was not entirely still. The occasional snort of a horse from the stables, the soft murmur of a distant stream, the faint creak of a tent pole in the wind, these were the subtle sounds that punctuated the quiet, a testament to the living, breathing entity that was the Roman legion. As the night deepened, a profound sense of isolation settled over the sentries. They were alone with their thoughts, alone with the vastness of the darkness, alone with the weight of their responsibility. Yet, there was also a sense of purpose, a quiet pride in their unwavering dedication. They were the guardians of the camp, the silent protectors of their sleeping comrades. Their vigilance ensured the safety and security of the entire legion. The hours before dawn were often the coldest, the darkest, and the most challenging. The body craved rest, the mind yearned for sleep, but duty demanded wakefulness. They pushed through the discomfort, their resolve unwavering, their commitment absolute. The first faint blush of dawn on the eastern horizon was a welcome sight, a subtle promise of the day to come. The darkness began to recede, replaced by a soft, gray light that gradually illuminated the camp. The shapes of the tents, once indistinct, began to sharpen, their outlines becoming clear. The sounds of the camp slowly began to awaken. The first stirrings of men, the gentle clatter of mess kits, the low murmur of voices. The night, with its silent vigil, was drawing to a close. The sentries, their duty fulfilled, would soon be relieved, their bodies weary but their minds at peace. They had stood guard, they had protected, and they had ensured the safety of their comrades. The cycle would begin anew, a relentless rhythm of duty, labor, and quiet endurance. And as the sun rose, casting its first golden rays upon the camp, the Roman legionary would awaken, refreshed and ready to face another day, another cycle of monotonous tasks, another testament to the enduring strength and resilience of the empire. The air, once thick with the silence of the night, began to fill with the subtle sounds of a waking camp. The distant crow of a rooster, the gentle lowing of cattle from a nearby farm, the soft chirping of birds in the trees. These were the harbingers of a new day, a slow awakening that mirrored the gradual return of light to the sky. The sentry, his eyes still scanning the horizon, felt a subtle shift in the atmosphere, a change in the quality of the air that signaled the approaching dawn. The stars, which had been so prominent just moments before, began to fade, their brilliance diminished by the encroaching light. The moon, if it had been present, would now be a pale, ghostly disk, slowly retreating from the sky. The ground beneath his feet, which had been cold and unyielding throughout the night, began to absorb the first faint warmth of the rising sun. The dew, which had clung to the grass and leaves, shimmered with a fleeting brilliance, reflecting the nascent light. The outlines of the tents, which had been indistinct shadows, now stood out in sharp relief, their canvas surfaces catching the first rays of the sun. The sounds of the camp became more distinct, more purposeful. The gentle clatter of mess kits, the low murmur of voices, the rhythmic crunch of boots on the gravelly ground, these were the sounds of men preparing for another day of duty, another cycle of labor and discipline. The sentry, his watch almost complete, felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. He had performed his duty, he had kept vigil, and he had ensured the safety of his comrades. The night, with its silent challenges, had been successfully navigated. Soon, he would be relieved, and he would join the ranks of his fellow legionaries, ready to face the demands of the new day. The cycle continued, an endless repetition of work, rest, and preparation, each segment flowing seamlessly into the next. The Roman legionary, a master of both warfare and construction, was also a master of endurance, his life a continuous testament to the unwavering strength and resilience of the empire. And as the sun rose, casting its first golden rays upon the camp, the Roman legionary would awaken, refreshed and ready to face another day, another cycle of monotonous tasks, another testament to the enduring strength and resilience of the empire. Introduction to the problem of slavery in pre-revolutionary Russia. The history of slavery in Russia is a complex and multifaceted phenomenon that evolved over many centuries. Unlike the classical forms of slavery known in ancient civilizations, Russian slavery, or Kolapstvo, had its own unique characteristics and development paths. From the earliest periods of the formation of the old Russian state, various forms of dependence existed, which gradually transformed into a more formalized system. The sources of Kolapstvo were diverse: debt, capture in war, self-sale due to poverty, or birth to a Kolap mother. Initially, Kolapstvo was not always hereditary and could be temporary, but over time, it acquired a more rigid and hereditary character. The legal status of Kolaps was ambiguous, fluctuating between a slave and a free person, depending on the historical period and specific circumstances. The development of Kolapstvo was closely linked to the socioeconomic and political processes in Russia, including the formation of a centralized state and the strengthening of the service nobility. Early forms of dependence in ancient Rus. In ancient Rus, various forms of dependence existed even before the emergence of formalized Kolapstvo. These included zakupi, who were people who worked off a loan, kupa, ryadovichi, who entered into a contract, ryad, for work, and smrti, who were free peasants but were gradually drawn into dependence on princes and boyars. The main source of dependence was debt. If a person could not repay a loan, they became a zakup and had to work for the creditor until the debt was repaid. The legal status of zakupi was regulated by Russkaya Pravda, the ancient Russian code of laws. They had certain rights, but their freedom was limited. Ryadovichi, on the other hand, voluntarily entered into contracts for work, but their dependence could also become long-term. Smrti were free peasants who owned land, but over time, they became increasingly dependent on the state and large landowners. These early forms of dependence laid the foundation for the future development of Kolapstvo and serfdom, gradually restricting the freedom of the rural population. The influence of the Golden Horde on the development of dependence. The Mongol Tatar invasion and the subsequent yoke of the Golden Horde had a significant impact on the development of dependence in Russia. The need to pay a heavy tribute, vaikod, to the horde led to the impoverishment of the population and the growth of debt. Many people, unable to pay the tribute, were forced to sell themselves into Kolapstvo or become dependent on more prosperous individuals. The horde also contributed to the strengthening of princely power, which, in turn, led to a greater centralization of control over the population. The princes, collecting tribute for the horde, gained more power over their subjects, which contributed to the further encirclement of peasants. The constant raids and military conflicts also led to an increase in the number of captives, who became kolaps. Thus, the Golden Horde, although it did not directly introduce slavery, indirectly contributed to the strengthening and spread of various forms of dependence in Russia, exacerbating the already difficult situation of the population. The formation and development of Kolapstvo. The formation and development of Kolapstvo as a distinct social institution occurred gradually over several centuries. By the 15th to 16th centuries, Kolapstvo became a widespread phenomenon in Russia. Kolaps were divided into several categories. Full kolaps, who were completely deprived of rights and were the personal property of the master, Akladnia kolaps, who became kolaps by special decree, and Kabala kolaps, who became kolaps due to debt. The legal status of kolaps was regulated by various legislative acts, including the Sudebniks of 1497 and 1550. These documents formalized the hereditary nature of kolapstvo and expanded the rights of masters over their kolaps. Kolaps were used in various fields. In agriculture, as domestic servants, as artisans, and even as soldiers. The growth of kolapstvo was associated with the development of large landlord economies and the need for cheap labor. However, kolapstvo also created social tension and led to numerous escapes and revolts of kolaps. The government tried to regulate kalopstvo, but it remained a significant part of the social structure of pre-revolutionary Russia until its gradual decline in the 18th century. ####The transition from kalopstvo to serfdom. The transition from kalopstvo to serfdom was a complex and lengthy process that occurred in the 16th to 17th centuries. Initially, kalopstvo and serfdom existed in parallel, but gradually, serfdom became the dominant form of dependence. This was due to several factors. Firstly, the state was interested in securing the taxpaying population to the land to ensure the collection of taxes and the provision of military service. Secondly, the nobility, who received land for their service, needed a stable labor force. The encirclement of peasants was carried out through a series of legislative acts, including the introduction of forbidden years, zapovedny leta, during which peasants were prohibited from leaving their land, and the establishment of an indefinite search for runaway peasants. The culmination of this process was the adoption of the Sobornoi Yelazanai of 1649, which finally bound peasants to the land and made them the property of landowners. Thus, kalopstvo, as a separate institution, gradually faded into the background, giving way to serfdom, which became the primary form of dependence in Russia for the next 2 centuries. ###The socioeconomic context of early dependence. The socioeconomic context of early dependence in Russia was characterized by vast territories, low population density, and a predominantly agrarian economy. The lack of a free labor market and the need to secure a workforce for agricultural production contributed to the development of various forms of dependence. The state, in turn, played an active role in this process, supporting the nobility and large landowners, who were the main pillars of its power. The development of trade and craft production was limited, and the economy was largely natural. The social structure was hierarchical, with princes, boyars, and service people at the top, and various categories of dependent population at the bottom. The constant military conflicts and the need to defend borders also contributed to the strengthening of state power and the encirclement of the population. All these factors created a unique historical context in which the system of slavery and dependence in Russia developed, differing from similar phenomena in other countries. Understanding this context is crucial for a comprehensive analysis of the problem. Serfdom as the primary form of dependence. Serfdom in Russia represented a system of legal norms that established the dependence of peasants on landowners and the state. This system evolved over several centuries, gradually restricting the freedom of peasants and binding them to the land. One of the key moments in this process was the introduction of St. George's Day, Yuriev Den, at the end of the 15th century. St. George's Day was a 2-week period, a week before and a week after November 26th, when peasants had the right to move from one landowner to another, having settled their accounts with the previous master. This right was limited but still provided peasants with some freedom of movement. However, with the strengthening of centralized power and the growing need for labor by the nobility, the right of transfer gradually became restricted. The culmination of the encirclement process was the adoption of the Sobornoi Yelazanai Code of Law of 1649, which finally bound peasants to the land and made them the property of landowners. The Sobornoi Yelazanai abolished St. George's Day, established an indefinite search for runaway peasants, and formalized the hereditary nature of serfdom. Thus, serfdom became the primary form of dependence in pre-revolutionary Russia, encompassing a significant portion of the population. The legal status of serfs was extremely low. They did not possess personal freedom and were considered part of the landowner's property. Serfs were tied to the land, meaning they could not leave their allotments without the landowner's permission. This attachment to the land was one of the fundamental principles of serfdom. Landowners had the right to sell, gift, mortgage, and exchange serfs, both separately from the land and together with it. The sale of people without land, although legally restricted during certain periods, was widely practiced. Serf families could be separated during sales, leading to the destruction of family ties. Serfs could not appear in court without the landowner's permission and had no right to property, although they could de facto own movable property. Their marriages were concluded with the landowner's consent, and the children of serfs automatically became serfs of the same landowner. Thus, the legal status of serfs was close to that of slaves, although formally they were not considered slaves. ###Economic foundations of serfdom. The economic foundations of serfdom were based on the exploitation of peasant labor. There were two main forms of exploitation: corvée, barshchina, and quit-rent, obrok. Corvée was the obligatory work of peasants on the landowner's land. Peasants had to cultivate the landowner's land, perform various agricultural tasks, and engage in construction and repair. Quit-rent was a natural or monetary payment that peasants made to the landowner for the use of the land. Natural quit-rent could include grain, livestock, poultry, honey, wax, and other agricultural products. Monetary quit-rent was paid in money. The choice between corvée and quit-rent depended on the region, the type of the landowner's economy, and their personal preferences. In the Black Earth regions, where the land was more fertile, corvée predominated, as it allowed landowners to maximize profits from peasant labor. In non-Black Earth regions, where the land was less fertile, quit-rent was more often applied, as peasants could engage in crafts and trade to earn money for quit-rent payments. Serfdom provided landowners with cheap labor and allowed them to maintain large-scale farming based on natural production. However, this system hindered the development of commodity-money relations and prevented the modernization of agriculture. ##### The Sobornoi Ulazanai of 1649 and its impact. The Sobornoi Ulazanai of 1649 marked the culmination of the encirclement process. This legislative act systematized and solidified all previously existing norms concerning peasant dependence. The Ulazanai definitively abolished the peasants' right to move on St. George's Day, established an indefinite search for runaway peasants and their descendants, which meant lifelong and hereditary attachment to the land. For the first time in Russian history, peasants were officially recognized as the property of landowners, leading to their complete loss of personal freedom. Landowners gained virtually unlimited power over their peasants, including the right to judge and punish, albeit with some limitations, such as the prohibition of murder. The Ulazanai also regulated relations between landowners and the state, obliging landowners to be responsible for collecting taxes from peasants and providing recruits for the army. Thus, the Sobornoi Ulazanai of 1649 completed the formation of serfdom in Russia, transforming it into a rigid and comprehensive system. #### Peculiarities of serfdom in Russia compared to Western Europe. The development of serfdom in Russia had its peculiarities compared to Western European feudalism. In Western Europe, serfdom gradually weakened and disappeared, giving way to new forms of economic relations. In Russia, on the contrary, serfdom intensified and reached its peak in the 18th century. This was due to several factors: vast territories and low population density, which created a labor shortage, the need to provide service nobility with land and peasants for their service to the state, and the peculiarities of political development, including the strengthening of autocratic power. Serfdom became the foundation of the Russian economy and social structure, ensuring stability and income for the nobility, but at the same time hindering the development of industry and trade. It created deep social contradictions and prevented the formation of civil society. #### The all-encompassing influence of serfdom on Russian society. The influence of serfdom on Russian society was all-encompassing. It determined the social hierarchy, economic relations, cultural characteristics, and even the mentality of the population. Serfs constituted the overwhelming majority of the country's population, and their position directly influenced the development of the state. The system of serfdom contributed to the preservation of archaic forms of farming, hindering the introduction of new technologies and agricultural methods. It also generated social tension, expressed in numerous peasant uprisings and revolts. Although serfdom provided stability for the nobility and the state in the short term, in the long term it became a serious obstacle to the modernization and development of Russia. Its abolition in 1861 became one of the most important events in the country's history, opening the way for new socio-economic transformations. The abolition of serfdom and its consequences. The abolition of serfdom in Russia in 1861 became one of the key events in the country's history, marking the beginning of a new era. The reasons that prompted the government to undertake such radical transformations were diverse and interconnected. Firstly, economic factors played a significant role. Serfdom, based on forced labor, hindered the development of agriculture and industry. The productivity of serf labor was low, and landlord economies, oriented towards natural production, could not compete with developing capitalist enterprises. The absence of a free labor market prevented the formation of a workforce for the growing industry. Secondly, social factors were also important. Serfdom generated deep social contradictions and tensions. Numerous peasant unrests and revolts, although suppressed, testified to growing discontent and the threat to social stability. Thirdly, political reasons also contributed to the abolition of serfdom. Russia's defeat in the Crimean War, 1853 to 1856, clearly demonstrated the country's backwardness and the need for profound reforms. Serfdom was considered one of the main causes of this backwardness. In addition, the moral and ethical aspect also played a role. Serfdom was increasingly perceived as an immoral and unjust phenomenon, incompatible with the principles of enlightenment and humanism. The Manifesto of February 19, 1861, on the most gracious granting to serf people of the rights of free rural inhabitants, and the regulations on peasants who have emerged from serf dependence, became the main legislative acts that abolished serfdom. The manifesto proclaimed the personal freedom of peasants, granting them civil rights, such as the right to conclude transactions, own property, engage in trade and crafts. Peasants ceased to be the property of landowners and acquired the status of free rural inhabitants. However, the land they cultivated remained the property of the landowners. Peasants received the right to redeem their allotments, but until redemption, they were considered temporarily obligated and had to continue to bear obligations in favor of the landowner, corvée, or quit-rent. The amount of redemption payments was significant, and peasants often did not have sufficient funds for redemption. The state provided peasants with loans for land redemption, but these loans had to be repaid within 49 years with interest. Thus, peasants, having gained personal freedom, found themselves in debt to the state. The consequences of the abolition of serfdom were diverse and contradictory. On the one hand, the abolition of serfdom contributed to the development of capitalist relations in agriculture and industry. A free labor market emerged, which stimulated the development of factories and plants. On the other hand, the reform also had negative consequences. Redemption payments became a heavy burden for peasants, many of whom found themselves in poverty. The landlessness of peasants, i.e., the reduction in the size of their allotments compared to pre-reform ones, led to agrarian overpopulation and the exacerbation of the land question. The formation of new social strata, such as the rural bourgeoisie, kulaks, and the proletariat, led to an increase in social stratification in the countryside. The reform did not solve all problems but created new ones, which became a source of social tension in subsequent decades. Nevertheless, the abolition of serfdom was a necessary step for the modernization of Russia and its integration into the world economic system. It opened the way for further reforms and transformations that changed the face of the country. Details of the 1861 reform included not only the proclamation of personal freedom for peasants but also a complex system of land relations. Peasants received land allotments for use, the size of which was determined by local regulations and depended on the region. In the Black Earth provinces, where land was more valuable, peasants often had surplus land, which they had used before the reform but belonged to the landowner, cut off. This led to the so-called otreski, cut-off lands, which caused discontent among peasants. In non-Black Earth provinces, on the contrary, peasants could be allocated additional land if their allotments were too small. Until the land was redeemed, peasants were in a temporarily obligated state, meaning they continued to bear obligations in favor of the landowner. This period could last until the peasant redeemed their allotment. The redemption operation was carried out with the mediation of the state. The landowner received a redemption loan from the state, and the peasant had to repay this loan to the state within 49 years. The amount of redemption payments was calculated to compensate landowners for the loss of serf souls and land. However, in practice, the cost of land was often overestimated, making the redemption burden unbearable for peasants. The long-term consequences of the abolition of serfdom were significant. In agriculture, the process of capitalization began, and new forms of farming emerged, such as peasant farms and land leases. However, this process was slow and uneven. The peasant commune, which was preserved after the reform, continued to play an important role in village life. regulating land relations and distributing obligations. Communal land ownership, with its land redivisions, hindered the development of individual peasant farms and prevented the introduction of new agricultural methods. Social stratification in the countryside intensified. Prosperous peasants, kulaks, emerged, who used hired labor and bought land, and poor peasants, who were forced to sell their labor or go to cities for work. The abolition of serfdom also contributed to the growth of cities and the development of industry, as liberated peasants replenished the ranks of the urban proletariat. However, this process was accompanied by an increase in social tension in cities, associated with difficult working and living conditions for workers. Thus, the abolition of serfdom in 1861 was a complex and contradictory process that had both positive and negative consequences. It eliminated an archaic system of dependence, opened the way for the capitalist development of Russia, and contributed to the formation of new social relations. However, the reform did not solve all problems but created new ones, which became a source of social conflicts and revolutionary upheavals in the early 20th century. Nevertheless, without the abolition of serfdom, the further development of Russia would have been impossible. This reform became the starting point for a series of transformations that changed the face of the country and determined its future destiny. Studying this period allows for an understanding of the complexity of historical processes and the diversity of their consequences. Life and daily routine of serf peasants. The daily life of serf peasants was dictated by the agricultural cycle and the demands of the landowner. The primary occupation was labor on the land, both on the landowner's estate, corvée, and on their own plots, quitrent. The workday began at dawn and ended at dusk, especially during sowing and harvesting periods. The labor was arduous and monotonous, performed manually or with primitive tools. In addition to field work, peasants engaged in household chores, livestock care, firewood collection, and other necessary tasks. The family played a central role in the life of a serf peasant. It was the main production and consumption unit, ensuring survival and the reproduction of the labor force. Marriages were concluded early, and large families were the norm, as children provided additional labor. The commune, or mir, was an important element of the serfs' social organization. It regulated land relations, distributed obligations, resolved disputes, and provided mutual assistance. The commune also acted as an intermediary between the peasants and the landowner, representing the peasants' interests before the authorities. The culture and traditions of serf peasants were closely intertwined with their daily lives and the agricultural calendar. Folklore, including songs, fairy tales, proverbs, and sayings, was passed down through generations and reflected the worldview, values, and aspirations of the peasants. Many songs were associated with labor, rituals, and holidays. The beliefs of serfs were syncretic, combining elements of Orthodox faith with ancient pagan beliefs. Numerous omens, rites, and rituals existed, aimed at ensuring a good harvest, protection from diseases, and evil forces. Holidays, both church and folk, were an important part of peasant life, providing an opportunity for rest, communication, and emotional expression. On these days, work ceased, festivities were held, songs were sung, and round dances were performed. However, even on holidays, peasants remained under the control of the landowner, and their freedom was limited. The living conditions of serf peasants were modest and often difficult. Their dwelling was an izba, a wooden hut with an earthen floor and a small stove. A large family, consisting of several generations, usually lived in one izba. The furniture was primitive, consisting of benches, a table, and chests. Lighting was provided by a splinter or an oil lamp. Heating was done by the stove, which was also used for cooking. The diet of serfs was monotonous and depended on the harvest. The staple foods were bread, porridges, vegetables, cabbage, turnips, onions, as well as mushrooms and berries. Meat and dairy products were rare, consumed mainly on holidays. Clothes were made from homespun materials, linen and hemp. They were simple, functional, and intended to protect against cold and heat. Hygiene was at a low level due to the lack of access to clean water and soap. Diseases were widespread, and medical care was practically non-existent. All these factors contributed to high mortality, especially among children, and a low life expectancy for serf peasants. The social structure within the peasant commune was relatively simple but had its peculiarities. At the head of the commune was the elder, elected by the peasants or appointed by the landowner. The elder was responsible for collecting taxes and duties, resolving minor disputes, and maintaining order. Elected officials, such as Satsky and Desiatsky, who assisted the elder in administration, also played an important role. Within the commune, there was a certain stratification. There were more prosperous peasants who had more land and livestock, and poor ones who barely made ends meet. However, the commune strived for an egalitarian distribution of land and obligations to ensure the survival of all its members. This was due to collective responsibility, where the entire commune was responsible for the failure of one peasant to fulfill obligations. Women played a key role in the peasant family. They were engaged in household chores, raising children, and actively participated in agricultural work. Their labor was no less arduous than men's, and often more diverse. Children were involved in feasible labor from an early age, helping their parents in the field and at home. They quickly mastered the necessary skills and became full-fledged workers. The childhood of serfs was short, and at a young age they became full-fledged laborers. The impact of harsh living conditions on the physical and mental state of serf peasants was significant. Insufficient nutrition, heavy physical labor, lack of qualified medical care, and constant psychological pressure from the landowner led to a high level of morbidity and early mortality. Infectious diseases such as typhus, cholera, smallpox, as well as diseases associated with malnutrition and unsanitary conditions, were widespread. Peasants often suffered from chronic diseases that reduced their working capacity and quality of life. The psychological state of serfs was also difficult. The constant threat of punishment, humiliation, separation from family, and the lack of prospects for changing their situation led to apathy, depression, and submission. However, despite all the difficulties, peasants preserved their culture, traditions, and faith, which helped them survive and find meaning in life. They found solace in the commune, in family ties, in religious rites, and folk holidays. These cultural elements served as a kind of protective mechanism, allowing them to maintain their identity and dignity in conditions of unfreedom. Thus, the life and daily routine of serf peasants were filled with hard labor, deprivation, and limitations. However, they managed to create their unique culture based on communal values, traditions, and beliefs. Studying their daily lives allows for a deeper understanding of the social and economic realities of pre-revolutionary Russia, as well as an appreciation for the resilience and vitality of the Russian peasantry under serfdom. These aspects are important for a full understanding of the historical context and consequences of serfdom. State policy regarding serfdom. State policy regarding serfdom in pre-revolutionary Russia was contradictory and changed over centuries. On the one hand, the state actively contributed to the enserfment of peasants, seeing it as a way to secure the service nobility and maintain stability. On the other hand, as society developed and the negative consequences of serfdom became apparent, attempts were made to limit and regulate it. In the 18th century, during the reign of Catherine II, decrees were issued aimed at streamlining relations between landowners and peasants, but they did not lead to significant changes. Paul I, upon ascending the throne, issued the Manifesto on the Three-Day Corvée, 1797, which recommended that landowners limit corvée to 3 days a week. However, this manifesto was recommendatory and not always observed. Alexander I, at the beginning of his reign, showed interest in the peasant question. In 1803, the Decree on Free Cultivators was issued, which allowed landowners to release peasants to freedom with land for a ransom. This decree was an important step, but only a small number of peasants took advantage of it. Nicholas I, despite his conservative policy, also recognized the need to resolve the peasant question. Under him, secret committees were created to discuss reform, and reforms of state peasants were carried out, aimed at improving their situation. However, no radical changes occurred in the position of serfs. The state's role in maintaining and changing the system of serfdom was key. The state acted as a guarantor of landowners' rights over serfs, ensuring their protection and the return of runaway peasants. Legislation, starting from the Sudebniks and the Sobornoi Yelazanai, consistently enshrined and expanded the rights of landowners. However, as capitalist relations developed and peasant discontent grew, the state began to realize that serfdom was a hindrance to the country's economic development and a source of social tension. This led to a gradual change in policy aimed at finding ways to resolve the peasant question. In the first half of the 19th century, attempts were made to inventory landowners' estates, which was supposed to streamline peasant obligations. Restrictions were also introduced on the sale of peasants without land, and the separation of families was prohibited. These measures, although they did not abolish serfdom, were aimed at mitigating its most brutal manifestations and improving the situation of peasants. However, these measures were insufficient to solve the accumulated problems. Attempts to limit and regulate serfdom in the 18th to 19th centuries were due to various factors. Firstly, this was associated with Enlightenment ideas that spread in Europe and penetrated Russia. Many statesmen and intellectuals recognized the immorality and inefficiency of serfdom. Secondly, economic factors played an important role. Serf labor was unproductive, which hindered the development of agriculture and industry. Thirdly, social tension, expressed in numerous peasant unrests, forced the government to consider the need for reforms. However, the resistance of the nobility, who saw serfdom as the basis of their well-being, was very strong. The nobility had significant influence on state policy, which prevented radical reforms. Thus, state policy regarding serfdom was a compromise between the interests of various social groups and the need to maintain stability in the country. Alexander I's activities in the peasant question were marked by attempts at liberalization. In addition to the decree on free cultivators, which, despite its limited application, laid the legal foundation for the emancipation of peasants with land, Alexander I also considered projects for the complete abolition of serfdom. However, these projects were not implemented due to the resistance of the nobility and the government's fears of possible social upheavals. Nevertheless, the decree on free cultivators became an important precedent, showing the possibility of emancipating peasants not only without land, but also with an allotment. This was a fundamentally new approach, which later formed the basis of the 1861 reform. Also, under Alexander I, steps were taken to improve the situation of state peasants, who were in a better position than landlord peasants, but were also tied to the land and bore obligations to the state. These measures included streamlining taxes and obligations, as well as attempts to develop education and healthcare in state villages. Nicholas I, despite his reputation as a conservative, also paid attention to the peasant question. He understood that serfdom was a powder keg under the state and would sooner or later lead to an explosion. Under him, several secret committees were created to discuss ways to resolve the peasant question. These committees developed a number of projects aimed at limiting serfdom, but none of them were fully implemented. The most significant reform of Nicholas I was the reform of state peasants, carried out by P.D. Kiselev. This reform improved the situation of state peasants, granting them self-government, streamlining obligations, and promoting the development of education and medicine. The purpose of the reform was to set an example for landowners on how to organize farming without serfdom. However, landlord peasants, who constituted the majority, remained in their former position. Nicholas I also prohibited the sale of peasants without land and the separation of families, which was an important step in limiting the arbitrariness of landowners. These measures, although they did not abolish serfdom, indicated the government's growing awareness of the need to reform it. Overall, state policy regarding serfdom until 1861 was characterized by caution and inconsistency. The government recognized the need for reforms, but was afraid to take radical steps due to fears of resistance from the nobility and possible social upheavals. Serfdom was deeply rooted in the economic and social structure of Russia, and its abolition required not only political will but also careful preparation. Nevertheless, every attempt to limit and regulate serfdom, even if it did not lead to immediate results, contributed to the formation of public opinion and created prerequisites for future reform. These steps, although half-hearted, demonstrated the evolution of views on serfdom and the gradual approach to its abolition. Thus, state policy, despite its contradictions, played an important role in preparing society for the great transformations of 1861. Other forms of slavery and dependence in pre-revolutionary Russia. In addition to serfdom, other forms of slavery and dependence existed in pre-revolutionary Russia, which, although not as widespread as serfdom, nevertheless affected significant segments of the population. One such form was kolobstvo, bondage, which, despite its antiquity, continued to exist even after the abolition of serfdom in 1861. Kolobs, unlike serfs, were not tied to the land and were the personal property of the master. Their status could be acquired through various means, including capture in war, self-sale due to debt or poverty, or birth to a kolob mother. The legal and social position of kolobs varied over time, but generally, they had no rights and could be bought, sold, or inherited. They performed various tasks, from agricultural labor to domestic service and military duties. The evolution of kolobstvo is intertwined with the development of the Russian state and its legal system, reflecting the changing needs of the ruling class and the broader economic landscape. Kabala, indentured servitude, and debt bondage represented another form of unfreedom. Kabala was a contract by which a person undertook to work for a creditor until the debt was repaid. Often, the terms of such contracts were extremely unfavorable to the debtor, and the debt could grow faster than it could be worked off, leading to lifelong or even hereditary dependence. Debt bondage was especially common among the poor, who, lacking means of subsistence, were forced to borrow from moneylenders or more prosperous peasants. The inability to repay the debt led to the loss of personal freedom and transformation into a Kabala kolob. Legislation attempted to regulate Kabala relations, but in practice, abuses were widespread. This form of dependence was particularly characteristic of cities and industrial centers, where a market for hired labor was forming, but effective mechanisms for protecting workers' rights were absent. Slavery on the outskirts of the empire had its own peculiarities, due to local traditions and cultural differences. In the Caucasus and Central Asia, annexed to the Russian Empire in the 19th century, traditional forms of slavery existed that differed from Russian serfdom. Here, slavery was associated with military conflicts, captivity, and debt bondage. Slaves were used in agriculture, as domestic servants, and in craft production. The Russian administration, when annexing these territories, faced the problem of the existence of slavery. In some cases, attempts were made to abolish it, but these measures often met with resistance from the local population and elites, for whom slavery was part of their traditional way of life. Therefore, the process of eliminating slavery on the outskirts of the empire was long and complex, often formal in nature, and in fact, slave relations could persist in a hidden form for a long time. The peculiarities of slavery on the outskirts of the empire also lay in its ethnic and religious aspect, which distinguished it from serfdom in central Russia. The disappearance of kolobstvo after the abolition of serfdom was a gradual process. Although the Manifesto of 1861 did not directly concern kolobs, many of them, especially household serfs, gained personal freedom. However, they did not receive land, which put them in an extremely difficult economic situation. Many former household serfs continued to work for their former masters for minimal pay or for food and shelter, as they had no other means of subsistence. This created a situation where formerly free people actually remained in a dependent position. The state took some measures to alleviate their situation, for example, by granting them the right to resettle or to receive small land allotments. However, these measures were insufficient to solve the problem. The complete disappearance of kolobstvo as a social phenomenon occurred only by the beginning of the 20th century, when the development of capitalist relations and the growth of industry created new employment opportunities and provided wider opportunities for social mobility. Nevertheless, the historical memory of kolobstvo and its consequences remained part of the collective consciousness. The mechanisms of Kabala, indentured servitude, and debt bondage were diverse. Often, it began with a small loan that a person took to meet urgent needs, for example, to buy grain in a lean year or to pay taxes. The interest rates on such loans were very high, and the debt grew rapidly. If the debtor could not repay the debt on time, they were forced to work it off, becoming a Kabala slave. The terms of working off the debt were often exploitative. The labor was hard, and the payment was minimal, which did not allow the debt to be repaid. In some cases, Debtors could be sold to other individuals, which further exacerbated their situation. Debt bondage was especially widespread in cities, where a market for hired labor was forming. Workers, lacking means of subsistence, often fell into bondage to factory owners or merchants who provided them with loans for work. This created a system where workers were tied to a specific enterprise and could not freely change their place of work. Legislation tried to combat Kabbalah, but in practice, these measures were ineffective due to corruption and the lack of effective control mechanisms. The peculiarities of slavery on the outskirts of the empire were due to their historical development and cultural traditions. In the Caucasus, for example, slavery was closely linked to military raids and captivity. Prisoners captured during hostilities became slaves and were used in various fields. In Central Asia, slavery was also widespread and had its own characteristics related to Islamic traditions and local customs. Slaves could be bought in markets, inherited, or received as gifts. The Russian administration, upon arriving in these territories, faced the problem of the existence of slavery. In some cases, decrees were issued to abolish slavery, but their implementation was difficult due to the resistance of the local population and the lack of effective control mechanisms. Often, slavery persisted in a hidden form, and former slaves continued to be in a dependent position. Thus, the elimination of slavery on the outskirts of the empire was a long and complex process that required not only legislative measures, but also profound social and economic transformations. These forms of dependence, although different from serfdom, were nevertheless a manifestation of unfreedom and exploitation of man by man. Relations between landowners and serfs. The relations between landowners and serf peasants in pre-revolutionary Russia were asymmetrical and determined by the legal status of serfdom. The landowner possessed extensive rights over their peasants, who were effectively their property. These rights included the right to labor, corvée, the right to receive quit rent, in kind or money, and the right to sell, gift, mortgage, and exchange peasants. The landowner also had the right to judge their peasants for minor offenses, inflict corporal punishment, exile them to Siberia, or conscript them into the army. They controlled the serfs' marriages, their movement, and even their choice of occupation. At the same time, the landowner had certain obligations towards their peasants, although these obligations were often formal. They were supposed to provide peasants with land for farming, protect them from external threats, and provide assistance in case of crop failure or natural disasters. However, the extent to which these obligations were fulfilled depended on the landowner's personal qualities and their attitude towards the peasants. Some landowners cared for their peasants, built schools and hospitals, while others showed cruelty and indifference. Forms of exploitation and abuse of power by landowners were diverse. In addition to obligatory duties, corvée and quit rent, landowners could demand additional work from peasants, such as building manor houses, roads, and bridges. They could increase the size of quit rent or corvée, disregarding the peasants' capabilities. Abuse of power manifested in cruel corporal punishments, rapes, separation of families during sales, and arbitrary confiscation of property. Some landowners converted their peasants into household serfs, depriving them of land and means of subsistence, and forcing them to perform domestic work. The position of household serfs was particularly difficult, as they were completely dependent on the landowner and did not even have their own farms. The arbitrariness of landowners was not always suppressed by the state, as landowners possessed significant power and influence locally. This created conditions for impunity and exacerbated the plight of serfs. Attempts at resistance and revolts by serf peasants were a constant phenomenon in the history of pre-revolutionary Russia. Peasants expressed their dissatisfaction in various ways, from passive resistance, poor work, damage to inventory, escapes, to open uprisings. The largest and most famous were the uprisings led by Stepan Razin in the 17th century and Emelian Pugachev in the 18th century. These uprisings covered vast territories and posed a serious threat to central authority. Peasants demanded the abolition of serfdom, land, and freedom. However, all these uprisings were brutally suppressed by government troops. In addition to large uprisings, there were numerous local revolts caused by the arbitrariness of landowners, famine, epidemics, or rumors of freedom. Peasants also filed complaints against landowners with state bodies, but these complaints rarely led to an improvement in their situation. Despite the suppression of revolts, they influenced state policy, forcing the government to consider the need for reforms and limitations on serfdom. The legal basis of relations between landowners and serfs was enshrined in various legislative acts, starting from the Sudebnik of 1497 and ending with the Sobornoi Yelazanai of 1649. These documents gradually expanded the rights of landowners over peasants and limited peasant freedom. However, even after complete enserfment, there were certain legal restrictions on the arbitrariness of landowners. For example, landowners were forbidden to kill their peasants, although in practice this rule was often violated. A landowner could be punished for killing a peasant, but such cases were rare and punishments were lenient. The state also tried to regulate relations between landowners and peasants, issuing decrees aimed at protecting peasants from excessive exploitation. However, these decrees often remained on paper, as the state lacked sufficient mechanisms for their control and enforcement. Thus, the legal system primarily protected the interests of landowners, leaving peasants virtually defenseless against their arbitrariness. Socio-psychological aspects of relations were complex and multifaceted. On the one hand, there was a deep chasm between landowners and serfs due to their different social status and economic position. Landowners viewed peasants as their property, and peasants, in turn, treated landowners with caution and distrust. On the other hand, there were also more complex forms of interaction, including elements of paternalism and dependence. Some landowners showed care for their peasants, provided them with assistance in difficult times, and built churches and schools. Peasants, in turn, could show loyalty and attachment to their landowners, especially if they were fair and kind. However, these relations always remained relations of domination and subordination, where the landowner possessed absolute power. Psychological pressure, humiliation, and fear were constant companions in the lives of serfs. This led to the formation of a special mentality, characterized by submission, cunning, and a desire for survival in conditions of unfreedom. The impact of relations between landowners and serfs on the development of Russian society was significant. This system created deep social contradictions that ultimately led to the abolition of serfdom. It also hindered the economic development of the country, preventing the formation of a free labor market and the development of capitalist relations. Cultural development also suffered from serfdom, as peasants were deprived of the opportunity to receive education and develop their talents. However, despite all the negative consequences, serfdom left a deep mark on the history of Russia, shaping its social structure, economy, and culture. Studying these relations allows for an understanding of the origins of many problems that Russia faces to this day, as well as an assessment of the scale and complexity of the peasant emancipation process. The legacy of slavery and serfdom in modern Russia. The legacy of slavery and serfdom in pre-revolutionary Russia influences the mentality and social relations in modern Russia. The long existence of a system of unfreedom, in which a significant part of the population was in a subordinate position, formed certain characteristics in public consciousness. These include paternalism, that is, the expectation of care and guidance from the authorities, as well as a low level of legal culture and civic engagement. The habit of submission and the lack of experience in independent decision-making, characteristic of serfs, could be passed down from generation to generation, influencing the formation of social norms and values. A certain hierarchy is also observed in social relations, where status and power play a significant role. These aspects are not a direct consequence of serfdom, but the historical experience of dependence could have contributed to their entrenchment. Discussions about serfdom in historiography and public consciousness continue to this day. There are various points of view on the role and significance of serfdom in Russian history. Some researchers emphasize its negative impact on the country's economic and social development, considering it a hindrance to progress. Others focus on its stabilizing role during certain periods, as well as on the peculiarities of its formation, distinguishing it from classical slavery. In public consciousness, serfdom is often associated with backwardness and injustice, but at the same time, elements of idealization of the past may be present, associated with the image of a kind master or a patriarchal village. These discussions reflect the complexity and ambiguity of historical experience, as well as society's desire to comprehend its past and learn from it. Understanding various interpretations of serfdom is important for forming an objective historical view. Lessons from history, drawn from the experience of slavery and serfdom, are important for preventing new forms of dependence and fighting for freedom. The history of serfdom demonstrates how gradually, step by step, human freedom was limited, and how important it is to value and protect civil rights and freedoms. It shows that economic dependence can become the basis for personal unfreedom, and that the struggle for social justice and equality is a continuous process. The experience of abolishing serfdom also emphasizes the complexity and multifaceted nature of social transformations, as well as the need to consider the interests of all segments of society. Modern forms of dependence, such as labor exploitation, human trafficking, and debt bondage, have their roots in historical forms of slavery and serfdom. Studying the past allows for identifying the mechanisms of unfreedom and developing effective measures to prevent it. The struggle for human freedom and dignity remains a relevant task, requiring constant attention and effort from society and the state. The influence of the historical experience of slavery on the mentality and social relations in modern Russia is manifested in various aspects. One of them is the preservation of paternalistic attitudes, where the population tends to expect solutions to problems from above and rely on state power, rather than on their own strength and initiative. This may be due to a centuries-old tradition when peasants were under the guardianship of the landowner, and then the state. A certain hierarchy is also observed in social relations, where status and belonging to certain social groups play a significant role. This may be an echo of the estate division of society that existed in pre-revolutionary Russia. A low level of legal culture and civic engagement can also be associated with historical experience, when human rights and freedoms were limited, and the law often served the interests of the ruling class. However, it is important to note that these features are not exclusively Russian and can be found in societies that have experienced long periods of unfreedom. Nevertheless, for Russia, this historical experience is of particular importance, as serfdom covered a significant part of the population and existed for several centuries. Discussions about serfdom in historiography and public consciousness are an important part of the process of understanding the past. In the Soviet period, serfdom was often portrayed as an absolute evil, a symbol of oppression and backwardness. In the post-Soviet period, new interpretations appeared, some of which tried to soften the negative image of serfdom, emphasizing its patriarchal character or economic expediency under certain conditions. These discussions reflect not only scientific disputes but also ideological battles related to the formation of national identity and the assessment of Russia's historical path. In public consciousness, the image of serfdom remains complex and contradictory. On the one hand, it is a symbol of unfreedom and oppression. On the other, it is part of national history that needs to be accepted and understood. Understanding these discussions allows for a deeper insight into the essence of the problem and avoids simplistic assessments. It is also important to consider that the historical memory of serfdom influences the modern perception of social justice, equality, and freedom. Lessons from history, drawn from the experience of slavery and serfdom, are relevant for modern Russia. They remind us that freedom is not something given once and for all, but requires constant protection and struggle. The history of serfdom shows how gradually, step by step, human rights and freedoms were limited, and how important it is to be vigilant to any manifestations of unfreedom. It also emphasizes that economic dependence can become the basis for personal unfreedom, and that the struggle for social justice and equality is a continuous process. Modern forms of dependence, such as labor exploitation, human trafficking, and debt bondage, although different from historical forms of slavery, nevertheless have common roots with them. Studying the past allows for identifying the mechanisms of unfreedom and developing effective measures to prevent it. The struggle for human freedom and dignity remains a relevant task, requiring constant attention and effort from society and the state. This includes the development of legal culture, strengthening civil society institutions, and creating conditions for economic well-being and social justice for all citizens. Only through understanding and overcoming the negative legacy of the past can a free and prosperous society be built.